but I can see from the abstracts we're going to be discussing gender and all kinds of context. So it's very pleased to welcome our speakers, Dylan Phelan and Dr. Rebecca Jones. So I think just to maximize the time, because we're always running out of time for questions, I'm just going to turn this over to Dylan, and we're all agog.
Hi there, thank you very much. And let me try and share my screen first. Hopefully this will work. Can we all see this?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so my name is Dylan Phelan. My talk today is entitled The Posthuman Eve, Metropolis Maria as a Prototype for Posthuman Sexualization. So my paper today will discuss the societal influences of Maria's filmic portrayal, its theoretical implications, and finally the lasting influence this portrayal has had on the genre of science fiction as a whole. So briefly, just to discuss the film itself. So Fixed-Line Metropolis tells the story of a futuristic city whose workers are completely dehumanized as they work in the underbelly of the mechanical city. Fredersen, who is a wealthy city master, along with the scientist Rotfang, create a robot in the likeness of Maria, who is a symbol of hope for the workers. This film is clearly a product of its time. Its depiction of the posthuman robotic subject as a savior is decidedly futurist in its ideology. Similarly, the film shares much of the utopian elements of modernist literature, as its eventual reconciliation of the head, the hand, and the heart creates a seemingly perfect solution to the issues of modernity. This film, released just 7 years after Rossum's Universal Robots, Metropolis is the first SF film to feature a truly post-human subject. In addition to the film's groundbreaking special effects and hugely influential cityscape aesthetic, its portrayal of the female android or robot has been vital, if an albeit somewhat overlooked contribution to the landscape of SF film. The influence of its early portrayal can be seen throughout the landscape of SF, as I've discussed. But before discussing these kind of intricate factors, I want to first discuss, excuse me, to frame this discussion through the kind of theoretical implications of posthumanism itself. So that's okay, perfect. Yeah. So in the context of posthuman theory, the posthuman subject is a theorized hybrid of human and machine. This liminal existence between the binaries of human and machine imbues a posthuman with this inherent ability to transgress and destabilize the hierarchical binaries of anthropocentric thought. So Donna Haraway, one of the foremost posthuman theorists, states that the tradition of racist male-dominated capitalism, the tradition of progress, the tradition of appropriation of nature as a resource for productions of culture, the tradition of reproduction from the self, from the reflections of the other, the relation between organism and machine has been a border war. And it is exactly this notion of the border that the posthuman seeks to challenge and disrupt. Similarly, Rosa Braidotti sees potential in the radical liminality of the posthuman, suggesting that they can be used to show difference without the usual connotations of hierarchy. But for Braidotti, concerning the hierarchical notion of gender within anthropocentric thought, she states that gender is just a historically contingent mechanism of capture of the multiple potentialities of the body. So consequently, for Braidotti, gender becomes a means of maintaining hierarchy and dominance for the posthuman due to the hierarchical connotations attached to gender. As I will discuss later, this means of restraint is vitally important in the framing and portrayal of Maria in the film. So despite this non-hierarchical quality of the posthuman subject, their filmic treatment paints a stark contrast. As Francesca Ferrando notes, the space of the symbolic other, historically attributed to women, people of colours other than white, non-heterosexual people, and so on, left empty, has been filled by the automata. This compulsion is somewhat unsurprising due to the perceived threat of the posthuman subject, since the very basis of privilege is underpinned by humanistic binaries and the assigned categories of other. Any subject with the ability to transcend those binaries reveals the socially constructed nature. Indeed, it appears that the posthuman inspires such a sense of corporeal anxiety that its liminal existence proves untenable. Instead, it is often attributed with a traditionally coded sense of gender, race, or sexuality, as a means of belaying the anxiety that it produces. Briefly, I'd like to go back to Simeon's talk again in what I think was his first video. The BBC newscaster spoke about one of the robots. He says, we'll refer to him as he because he is a he. And that's kind of what this theory gets at, that is the idea that once a robot or android or whatever it may be kind of crosses that threshold into the uncanny valley, it makes us uncomfortable, so we attribute it with a gender then to make us more kind of, to make it seem more human, to make it more approachable to us. But what my research kind of gets at, and what this talk really gets at, is what happens when we attribute more than just that. What happens when we attribute the kind of more problematic elements of gender to these creations as well. So with that then, it's my contention that these elements, these problematic or troubling elements, can be traced back to the very first iteration of the posthuman in film, i.e. Metropolis. So the social setting for Lang's film is vital in framing the portrayal of Maria, as this period of the 1920s saw a huge surge in urban mechanization, which dehumanized workers, leading to a rise in labour movements, which threatened the legitimacy of the ruling classes by upsetting social hierarchies. This era also saw the tail end of first-rate feminism, where women in many countries were beginning to gain more rights and challenge patriarchal order. This created a sense of change and anxiety, as the world appeared on the cusp of social upheaval, the ideal environment for the depiction of the machine woman. So considering Metropolis' arguably technophobic treatment of mechanization, it's not surprising that the film's posthuman subject, Maria, is portrayed as the chaotic, invasive, and disruptive culmination of technophobia. Interestingly, however, it's the association between this perceived corruption of technology and corporeal femininity which has proven so influential for the genre. The film's two main female characters, Maria and her robotic double, reveal this corruptive force of technology explicitly. So the human Maria appears as a symbol of hope and liberation for the city's workers. She is worshipped by the workers in the vein of the Virgin Mary, her apparent namesake. In the film's early scenes, Maria speaks to the workers in their underground meeting place. The setting evokes religious connotations such as a cross behind Maria, and the workers bowed in deep reverence. This ritualistic activity appears to satiate the workers as they await a mediator between themselves and the city's elites. Conversely, the scenes involving the robot are adorned with demonic or satanic imagery, such as a pentagram behind her head in Rothbang's laboratory. While both of these depictions portray a clear othering, the virginal woman and the demonic force of mechanization, it's the combination which provides an easily digestible and categorizable other for the fears of corporeal anxiety to be projected upon. Given the clear contradiction in aesthetic representation of these two characters, why then is the robot/android given the likeness of Maria? In describing this amalgamation of woman and machine, Andreas Huyssen notes how the feminine other becomes a natural conduit for the fears of mechanization and technology during this period. He states, as soon as the machine came to be perceived as a demonic threat and a harbinger of chaos and destruction, writers began to imagine the machine man as a woman. Importantly, the very existence of Maria is brought about by Fredericsson's plan to incite a doomed rebellion as a plot to legitimize his authority by co-opting and subverting the threat posed by the real Maria. In fact, even before Fredericsson's plan, the robot was always intended to be female. Rothbard had sought to create her in a subservient likeness of his lost love Hell. It seems then that it was never in doubt that the robot would be an extension of patriarchal hubris. Similarly, this connection between the new invasive threat and a pre-existing other appears to naturalize man's need for control, as by conquering woman, he can now conquer this new threat. On this, Huyssen similarly states, woman, nature, machine had become a mesh of signifiers, which all had one thing in common, otherness. By their very existence, they raised fears and threatened male authority and control. This then not only naturalizes a patriarchal sense and need for control and order at the expense of female freedoms, but also, by portraying the posthuman in this pre-othered manner, imposes a strictly codified sense of hierarchy, removing any movement towards nomadism or hybridity, as is discussed by Haraway and Rosa Ridotti. So, this amalgamation of woman and machine, in addition to naturalized patriarchal authority, has the effect of belittling and diluting the subversive charge posed by the posthuman other. So, as the robotic Maria leads the workers on a very chaotic rebellion, her actions actually unite the fractured inhabitants of the city by providing them with the ideal scapegoat. Indeed, following the destruction wrought by the rebellion, Maria, as in the fake Maria, is burned at the stake. The symbolism of the witch burning here clearly warrants discussion as it conjures association with both the Salem witch trials and Luddite revolts. It compounds the association between female sexuality and technology. This act seems to cleanse the city of both the dehumanizing effects of mechanization, as well as the threat posed to male authority by female agency. The symbolism here is clear. The original virginal Maria has been corrupted, having been corrupted by technology and female sexuality, has our image cleansed of this apparent corruption, just as the city itself is now free from this new invasive threat. As Heysen again states, it is then as if the expressionist sphere of technology and myth perceptions of a threatening female sexuality had both been exercised and reaffirmed by this metaphoric witch burning. And we can see the progression here in these images. As Maria begins to burn, her human likeness fades away, and it is revealed as this that she was this kind of invasive machine all along. In addition to the combination of categories of woman and machine, the resulting image of the false Maria is also a sexualized one. So this process of filmic sexualization not only aids in the amalgamation of categories woman and machine, but also assists in the dilution of the subversive charge posed by posthuman otherness. As Laura Mulvey notes, this process of sorry, I lost my place there. So this process of sexualization in the film confers onto woman a status of to be looked at-ness, which transforms the character from subject to object. Importantly, the seduction of femininity to the status of the image is very detrimental to any notion of transgression that she may have initially posed. For French theorist Guy Debord, this flattening of potential, of subversive potential is vital in maintaining status quo of hierarchy, as once the character has been reduced to the original object, the resulting image is completely removed from its original cause. In the film, this process is quite explicit, as one of Maria's first actions after getting sentience is to perform an exotic dance, as if to further compound the threatening forces of both mechanization and female sexuality. This scene shows the robotic Maria emerging from a stage as she begins to dance in an increasingly exotic fashion. Her dance is interspersed with quick cuts to disembodied eyes and an image of a preacher proclaiming the gross of Babylon or the whore of Babylon. The result is clear. This sexualized robotic Maria is the complete object of patriarchal anxiety. She is a combination of female agency and mechanical invasiveness. She exists as little more than a fixed point for those anxieties to be projected upon. By removing her agency as a female and eliminating any degree of posthuman liminality, this also creates a distance between the image of the robotic Maria, the robotic sexualized Maria, and the original cause of workers' liberation championed by the original Maria. Interestingly, this dancing highlights some semblance of agency for Maria, as her agency and sexuality is used in an almost weapon-like manner to the frightened gaze of a mostly male audience. However, this display is ultimately shown to be corrupt and damaging, as her actions sorry, excuse me. Take a drink of water. As her actions prove to be the embodiment of male fears cast upon her by her creators. It is no coincidence then that her erotic dance takes place before the workers' Catholic rebellion. By sexualizing and fetishizing Maria in this way, her subversive charge, i.e. her ability to inspire zeal in the workers, is diluted as she becomes an object rather than subject. Ultimately, this object fits neatly into the predefined category of other, which can be purged, re-establishing the status quo. This status quo is clear at the film's conclusion, as the workers are left in the same subordinate position as they were originally, albeit now under the direct control of humans. Interestingly, the film appears to take a somewhat paradoxical approach to this female agency and sexuality, as it is depicted simultaneously as something which is corruptive and anxiety-inducing, while also being a means to control and objectify. Importantly, it seems that it is an issue of control. As long as this sexuality can be controlled through patriarchal authority, it is then treated as a useful force. So, this amalgamation of the categories of woman and machine, first depicted on film in Metropolis, has carried out throughout the SF genre. So briefly, I'd like to discuss more recent examples of this post-human sexualization. One personal, most famous one that I'd say most of us know comes from Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, a film which has enjoyed a similarly impactful influence on the genre. So, in much the same way that the false Maria is framed as a combination of feminine sexuality and invasive mechanization, the result of which threatens humanistic authority, Blade Runner's Rachel is framed as a similar combination of these anxieties. So, considering Blade Runner's neo-noir aesthetic, Rachel is generally considered as the film's femme fatale, a character whose sexuality threatens male authority. This, as a genre staple, is usually subdued through a process of gender hierarchy. So this restrictive gendering is best shown in the now notorious rape scene, in which Deckard forcibly prevents Rachel from leaving his apartment. Deborah German notes that this scene acts as a culmination of Rachel's embodiment of the femme fatale trope, as the once dangerous, threatening presence of a liminal subject has, in this sense, been subdued by sexual conquest, and Rachel is now categorized as a female other. Additionally, it's important to note that Rachel's sexual history has been altered from the original novel, where she has had multiple sexual partners. This removal of her sexual agency creates a sense of naivety in her character, making her more susceptible to the aforementioned gender hierarchy. Considering the threat posed to human exceptionalism posed by replicants, as well as the threat posed to patriarchal authority by Rachel's femme fatale role, Deckard's sexual assault is comparable to Maria's burning at the stake, as it provides a means to simultaneously satiate both of these anxieties. By merging two categories into one, a threatened sense of humanistic and patriarchal authority is maintained. Similar examples can be seen in Alice Garland's Ex Machina, where the antagonist seeks to control a sentient AI through gender regulation, or in the early seasons of Nolan and Joy's Westworld, where the hosts are kept under control through strict adherence to social roles. But both of these examples portray female-coded posthumans who escape enslavement. The speculative process of sexualization remains relevant. While these more contemporary examples often depict a more nuanced reflection of the posthuman, the reliance on the genre staples of the machine woman seems to inevitably produce and reproduce a vision of posthumanism which is subject which is bound to the category of a sexualized female other. So, since the first iteration of the robot 100 years ago, its portrayal in theatre, text, and film has evolved significantly. Recent years have seen a huge surge in the number of androids, robots, cyborgs in film and television, as if in response to a greater influence of technology in modern life, as was the case with the likes of Rossman's Universal Robots and Metropolis. As ever, with both the socially created categories of other and the technologically created robot, they represent an embodiment of their creators' fears and anxieties. Since its creation, the robot, android, cyborg, or AI has been a futuristic vessel for past fears. In this process of recuperation, the radical liminality of posthumanism, posthuman otherness, is diluted and subverted. By sexualizing the posthuman, man maintains control over his monster. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, I've got a bit of an echo. Sorry about that. So I'd like to invite Rebecca now to take the controls.
Hello. Can you all hear me all right? Perfect. All right. So today I'll be presenting on Fabular, Femininity, Gynoids as modern mythmaking in live-action science fiction films. This is my doctoral research and is going to be distilled down and published in a monograph probably in the next year or so, depending on how long publishing takes. So I'll begin with my project, the questions I am seeking to answer, then a few terms you'll need to know going forward. From there, I'm going to present the firsts within the representations of robots and AIs on screen, then onwards to some of the broad data that I collected. Focusing from there on my scope for this project, I'll present the archetypes that I posit for these characters and my results for each archetype and their types, the numbers of films which exhibit each, and how these types have changed over time. Finally, I'll explain how my findings speak to the function of science fiction as a fabular space for cisgender male desires to play out, and how the evolution of artificial female presenting characters speaks to how this is changing over the past 100 years. Just quick check to make sure, can you all see my PowerPoint? Or is nobody seeing anything? You can? Excellent, brilliant, love it. All right. So terms you need to know going forward are automaton, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, early words for robots. Gynoid, which maybe some of you haven't heard yet, is simply a robot that presents as and is read as female, in the way that android is one that presents and is read as male. Because I'm talking a lot about gender distinctions, I wanted to have this built into my language to distinguish the presentation of those creations. For the ones that present as neither, or kind of like a neuter, I just simply call robot. When I talk about AI, artificial intelligence, it's characters who are holograms, voices, or otherwise disembodied physically, versus gynoids and other robots who have, while having AI as their software running them, they have physical forms. And again, this is just as a way of distinguishing between the different kinds of characters that I was examining. When I talk about the fabular, I am using it to mean how narratives, trends, and depictions that present stories and characters who can be read as fables, in this case as cautionary tales for viewers about robots, but also each film's contemporary understanding of femininity stereotypes and associated expectations. This has much to do with representation, but it's also a constant changing and exchanging process with other genres, the industry, and the society the film is produced in. Finally, I use Anne Cahill's proposed term derivatization to mean reducing one subject to a mere reflection of another subject's needs or desires. The desires, actions, and choices of derivatized women are required to mirror nothing but the desires of men. So I'm essentially using this as a replacement of sexual objectification, and that it better sort of embodies what a lot of these artificial females are created to be. So my thesis examined the representational evolution of female-presenting AI and robots in live-action American and British films from their start to the very end of 2018, kind of when my project was wrapping up. During my research, I came across Sunay's questions. Where are the films that feature female AIs as 1, protagonists, 2, not sexualized, and 3, whose story of liberation and empowerment is the main focus of the narrative? My thesis tried to answer these questions while asking its own. Firstly, it asks how and why on-screen AI and robots are presented as constructions which emphasize their gender as paramount to their character. Secondly, are such characters ever freed from male control within their films to present these stories of liberation and empowerment, or are they always submissively subordinated in their depictions? Finally, it addresses how a taxonomic approach, which views these characters as symbols within a modern SF mythos, enables us to explore and critique these characters' function as constructed dialogic symbols of idealized cisgender heterosexual male fantasies within the fabula of American and British science fiction film. Ursula K. Le Guin describes science fiction as the mythology of the modern world. The female-presenting robot, or gynoid, as I'm going to refer them, has been in live-action science fiction films for over 100 years. These sexless artificial creations present gender signifiers that allow them to be read and understood as female. However, they employ these signifiers allows us to explore how science fiction cinema's understanding of femininity has changed over the years from one strongly linked to subservience to presenting active defiance of those expectations. Yet, despite the range of gynoid depictions within these films, these characters are typically described either as fembots, female robots, or sexbots, just sex robots, both of which speak to a focus on their gender presentation and sexual use over all other representations. Thus, by tracing the history of these characters, I argue that inorganic creations act out a fabular femininity where heteronormative cisgender male fantasies construct an understanding of femininity. Since these modern myths tell us stories about idealized femininity, it is significant that within this fabular space, there is a representational shift away from objectified hyperfeminine presentations, these derivatizations, towards agentic persons as of the end of 2021, kind of hopped forward a bit because there's been some exciting new instances. Using a taxonomy and a film survey of over 300 films, I assert how Gynoids' representational trends are shifting towards depictions of agentic autonomy, speaking to the changes and overall shifts in the fabular tales science fiction is telling by the end of 2021. To begin at the beginning, the first ever robot ever caught on film was 1897's Gugusel Automat, the Clown and the Automaton, directed by Georges Millet, which unfortunately has no surviving copies. So we don't know how that robot appeared or may have acted besides the simple summary that a clown is surprised by the mechanical movements of an automaton. The first American gynoid on screen was 1911's The Inventor's Secret, followed in 1917 by the first American android on screen in The Clever Dummy, a comedic black and white silent film in which a mechanical man is created by an inventor but is replaced by the hapless assistant who accidentally breaks the automaton. The assistant then must continue the deception to greater hilarious lengths until he finally can no longer sustain the ruse. This sort of trend of artificial creation replaced by human continues for quite a bit in these early instances. So first gynoid in Germany was 1919's Die Puppe, The Doll, directed by Ernst Lubitsch. And like The Clever Dummy, again has a mechanical creation broken early on by an eager assistant and a human taking its place. In this case, Ossi, the daughter of the inventor Hilarius, taking the place of the doll who is modeled after her. And thus she secures herself a husband, the Baron's son Lancelot, who comes looking for an unintimidating artificial bride. The viewer sees that Ossi's artificial copy is not the first of Hilarius's gynoids, but instead he has a small army of them, all of which are operated by the turn of a wheel, and they are capable of performing simple tasks like dancing the can-can and flustering poor Lancelot, who is overwhelmed by the sight of so many women. He declares he wants one of good and proper character and favors Ossi's performance. The original doll is repaired by the end of the film, and Ossi is happily married. This pattern of duplication and place-taking continues once again in the first British instance in 1949's The Perfect Woman, directed by Bernard Knowles. In this film, we have an inventor creating a gynoid, Olga, who is modeled, in this case, on his niece Penelope. And in this instance, the model is played by a different actress, so is slightly different in appearance. Olga spends the entire film in this corset outfit, which doesn't seem to bother anyone who sees her. And she is purported to be perfect in every way, despite her clunky movements and inhuman posture. And just like 1919's Die Puppe, when the human woman Penelope swaps places with Olga, she finds herself a husband, and they are happily together at the end of the film. But in The Perfect Woman, Olga ends the film flailing and finally exploding off screen at the mention of the word love, thus beginning a trend continued in 4 more films within the 20th century where real women are preferred over the artificial, and the artificial is dead by the end of the film. We have the second American gynoid instance in the feature-length film 1965's Dr. Goldfoot and the Bikini Machine, directed by Norman Trog. This film is also a comedy, as the previous ones have been, except in this instance, the gynoids of the film spend most of their time in bikinis, as the title indicates, and they are designed by Dr. Goldfoot to woo rich men, give them to sign over their fortune, and then orchestrate their new husbands' deaths, thus enriching the good doctor. However, as with previous comedies, things go awry, and for all the genius of their creator, hijinks ensue, and his plans are foiled. As you can see on this promotional poster, these women are advertised as having a kiss button, a kill button, and a mystery button. Press the right button and it'll go, go, go. These are the beginning of the fembot sexbot stereotype that many of the subsequent characters have been subjected to. As this and its sequel film, Dr. Goldfoot and the Girl Bombs, the gynoids only function as sex objects used by Dr. Goldfoot for his own ends, with little complex functioning beyond that. So here's some of the broad data that I collected during this project. So far, and this is kind of semi-ongoing, I found at least 324 live-action films that have a robot and AI character presenting male, female, or neuter. I wanted to get a good idea of the films that were out there, even though my scope would inevitably get more focused in, because I wanted to know what other films were doing, what existed, and make sure that any statements I had weren't just applied to them, to be able to say if this is something exclusively happening for the female presenting instances or something that was occurring across the board. Turns out over half these films had female presenting AI or gynoid characters in them. So of the 324 films, 285 of them are American or British productions. Of the 324 films, there are only 2 female directors. Susan Seidelman for the film Making Mr. Right from 1987, and Erica as Eric Dapkowitz for the film Paradox Alice from 2012. There is, however, an interesting entry of the Matrix trilogy, which is from 1999 and 2003. The directors for these films are now Lana and Lily Wachowski, where at the time of production, they were brothers. They have both since transitioned and so are now sisters. They are an interesting sort of blip amongst what is otherwise a pretty cisgender male director pool, with these 4 directors being the only instances of non-cis male directors out of 324 films. Might seem appalling, yet it is unfortunately not surprising. As for my scope, once I had winnowed it down to just British and American productions with female presenting artificial characters, 122 films remained. After I viewed and studied these, I was able to trace the representational trends and organize them into 4 distinct archetypes. I'm not the first to suggest that these characters can be categorized, and my suggested archetypes are close to those previously suggested by Josiah Reichart. There are 3 main types of artificial women in fiction: a romantic and dreamlike woman endowed with spirit, wit, and intelligence, a practical household companion, and a passive doll whose great virtue, by saying practically nothing, is to become a flattering mirror for the man who falls in love with her. All 3 possess beauty, elegance, and charm. The archetypes that I found closely resemble these 3 types that Reichart has suggested. The first and most predominant, at least within the 20th century, is that of artificial sexuality, my own term. These characters are ones who are created or presented in dominantly sexual and romantic ways, tying in with Reichert's mention of these characters being romantic and dreamlike women or passive dolls. The second one that I found was service, so characters who are made to function as assistants or workers, again linking with Reichert's claim of them being practical household companions and passive dolls, as often those 2 are linked. And the third that I found is that of lethality, characters made to be violent or who become violent over the course of their film, something Reichart failed to notice amongst these characters. And finally, my own additional one is that of, it's not a standalone so much as one that threads throughout all the other ones, and that is the representation of sentience, characters who are or who progress towards being sentient autonomous agents rather than just obedient, thoughtless objects. Due to the project length, I chose to focus on only the artificial sexuality and sentience archetypes for my final thesis, the monograph that will be coming out. This first archetype, artificial sexuality, has sort of 4 types within it. The first is the Galatea type. So these are characters presented as the perfect model of womanhood, ideally and typically beautiful and obedient. This is seen when each of the 3 sort of first instances of women on screen for both history and within British and American productions. And these are the sort of gynoids that start the whole trend. The second of these is the girlfriend type, who are characters made to become romantic partners for humans or other artificials, and this can mean that they are literally created to be one or over the course of the film become one. This began with the Stepford Wives in 1975. The third is the mother type, who are characters not made to be mothers, but who become mothers either through construction, reproduction, or adoption of children. This first instance of this is in Galaxina in 1980, where she and her partner Sergeant Thor plan to order children, as well as the parts to make her sex capable from her manufacturer's catalog. Finally, the seductress type. These are characters created to be sexually attractive to men, which better allows them to infiltrate and seduce their targets, typically, at least initially, at the command of their creator, as shown and started with the Dr. Goldfoot and Bikini Machine 1965 film. I divided my analysis of films into essentially 2 centuries initially, so looking at the 20th century and then seeing how it's changed in the 21st. So in the 20th century, artificial sexuality dominated as the main archetype presented within my scope of films, with 38 out of 58 films. However, come the 21st century, this became 33 out of 61 films. Again, kind of giving you a rough idea of how much the films with robots has kind of spiked over the past 18 years compared to the previous 50. The evolution within the artificial sexuality is one greatly linked with the gradual increase in the sentience characters. So the Galatea type begins typically as controlled objects made femininely attractive to serve their users' desires within that capacity. But by the end of 2018, this changes from complete obedience to some autonomy, as the majority of them have a degree of overlap with the sentience archetype. And so while they are made to be a Galatea, they now grow beyond and reject often that purpose to assert their own selfhood. The girlfriend type's instance is originally made to be as a partner who has no choice in the matter, to love their user. However, by 2018, they've also overlapped with that sentience archetype, as I said, and at the end of the year, and they end typically and more often as equals who choose their relationships, are asked to be partners, and have their answer respected, if in the case, a very rare case they say no, as being given from an equal. Mothers notably all overlap with the sentience archetype as they choose to be mothers, though the children they care for shift from being constructed products of their loving heterosexual relationship to instead being entrusted to them by others who cannot care for them and being in non-traditional parenting partnerships. Finally, the seductress types instances begin also as controlled creations sent to seduce others for their creators, and end 2018 rejecting that function and again choosing their own actions, as they are almost all overlaps with the sentience archetype, with the notable shift from being controlled weapons used by men against other men to instead being autonomous threats, who use their derivatized appearances and social expectations around femininity and women as non-threatening sexual object to facilitate their infiltration and lethal actions. The sentience archetype sort of threads throughout, as I said, all the other archetypes I noticed, rather than being its own standalone. Its characters exist and function autonomously, are agents rather than objects, despite their artificial origins, or they grow into their personhood over the course of the film. Significantly, while 16 of the 58 films in the 20th century have sentience instances, this increases to 24 of the 61 films in the 21st century, and they are continuing to occur in films such as 2019's I Am Mother and 2021's Sungriho Space Sweepers from South Korea. The sentient archetype's evolution is one that begins with characters who grow into their personhood, typically because of their love for a man. A trend that occurred so often, I labeled it love is proof of / road to sentience, Laporte's. This shifted to characters being sentient from the start of their film, often again with a partner, but also at times alone or rejecting male advances. By the end of 2018, these characters are heroes, villains, tertiary characters, but all are agents. Often they have their personhood because they believed they were humans capable of making choices, and have no users or even clear creators. Does this matter? To me, it matters because the increase in sentient depictions indicates that science fiction film productions are being pushed to create more dynamic characters. This could be because of the higher demand for complex roles for women on screen and the growing acknowledgement of female audiences within the film industry. Either could give these productions the incentive to write characters who are more than just sexy Galateas. Secondly, while artificial sexuality was the dominant archetype of the 20th century, the fact that lethality and service surpass it in the 21st really indicates to me not only the rise in villainous characters within the lethality archetype, but also shows that female characters can be threatening individuals without the need for sexualization, as happens within that archetype as it evolves over time. The increasing instances of AI characters post-millennially indicates a rise in familiarity with real-world robots and AI such as female assistants like Siri, launched in 2011, or Alexa and Cortana, launched in 2014. Their existence within the real world makes it even more of a given that if there is an AI assistant within a filmic world, it will probably also be female. Additionally, the increase in service characters over artificial sexuality reflects not only the familiarity with AI assistants just mentioned, but also how real gynoids are being created as care robots in Japan, as well as how many general assistant robots that can help with information and even bank telling are also gendered female. Real sex robots, on the other hand, are still very expensive and have yet to achieve the complexity and functionality of their filmic counterparts' capabilities. This is still very much a dream, despite some of the news you might have read. The ones that do exist are typically very basic in ability and model, and their appearance is nothing like what you've seen on screen, and their cost make them very inaccessible to the general public. So while the 20th century's filmic artificial girlfriend was very common, in the 21st century, not only is she now her own person and less dependent and Galatea for her man, she's now able to be more than just a sex object. My work is helping to reclaim these overlooked and understudied characters. Firstly, I've uncovered the lack of female directors for these films. Additionally, these characters are often consigned to simply being fembots or sexbots in their representation, which, while still a prevalent type, is not the only kind to be seen, nor the dominant one. Many of these enveloped by this label are sentient characters, and much of their ability and positive representation is overlooked because of their attractiveness or function as a girlfriend or love interest within their film. Other aspects of my research that I've noticed but not really got the time to go into detail about are the high rate of fatality for many of these characters, which is more a function of these characters as a whole than just the female ones. And the lack of diversity within this character type, with most of the diversity occurring in films that had large numbers of gynoids, and typically they were used as sex robots. There are notably only 3 homosexual instances who choose their female partner, though in 2 cases they are controlled by a man to be his sexual partner, so it is not really clear how they might identify. Sadly, only the last of those 3 instances is alive at the end of her film. The second, Gina, is technically alive, but viewers of Battlestar Galactica series will know that she will later kill herself. And finally, there is the fact that there are rejections within each archetype, which occur when a character is sentient and so capable of rejecting their designed function. Though the degree of successful rejections and refusals is yet another interesting point to examine. So I argue that these characters and films can be viewed as part of a fabular SF mythology, which creates and reshapes their symbolic meanings over time. They do this by presenting the fable of the artificially created ideal woman and constructing a space where heterosexual cisgender male fantasies repeatedly play out the association of female presentation with sexual use, eroticization, and submissive subordination. This idealization and fantasy space acts as a dialogic mythos within American and British science fiction that speaks to our social and cultural fictive construction and understanding of femininity. These film fables are cautionary tales for men and women about objectifying sentient beings and the dangers of derivatization as they increasingly present more agentic depictions. They show how science fiction film's mythos has evolved within its cultural context to present women as more than just pleasure objects, even when that is their literal constructed purpose. These characters show how feminine sentient beings do not accept these limitations and subordination. That this shift happens in both nations' films and across production and distribution levels further emphasizes the prevalence of this shift within the industry. Notably, the more recent representations which overlap with the sentience archetype use their derivatization, often reclaiming their embodiments to control their appearance and so manipulate men's expectations to their benefit, as seen in films like Ex Machina. These films are a part of the modern myth-making of the science fiction genre, and as such, these characters are important figures who reveal the extent to which cisgender heterosexual male desire has made science fiction into its own fantasy space, where women and femininity are reduced to fetish objects and reflections of sexual desire. That this myth of subordinate submissive femininity is alternately reinforced and defined by these characters speaks to the complexity of their depictions and how American and British science fiction film has evolved over the past 8 decades. If you have any questions about my film list or examples, I'm happy to share and chat robot films. Thank you.
Thank you both, Rebecca and Dylan, for 2 cogent and complementary, if depressing, analyses, with perhaps a glimmer of hope there offered at the end, or at least directions forward suggested. So I'm going to throw open the floor because I'm sure there will be a lot of questions now. So it's hard for me to see actually who's got their hand up.
Oh, Curtis and Rachel.
Okay, yeah, good. I'm in the chat now. I can see that. So Curtis, please.
Thank you, Rebecca. I enjoyed that very much, and I'm really excited to read your publications. I was wondering if you've read Jeanette Winterson's Frankenstein too, because I know it's more literature, but she's very critical of kind of the sexism of the sex bot industry as well, and the kind of commodification of the female body. I was wondering if you've looked at that, the literature as well, or is it more predominantly film, I guess?
So my focus was film, in the sense that in fiction, it is decades ahead of what we see in film, in the same way that on television, that's actually like maybe a decade ahead of where we are in film. We've already, like, they were having sentient autonomous agents that were female gynoids way before film really started more consistently showing that. And within fiction, there are far more explorations of identity and how they feel as persons, how they want to physically present. The fact that it took South Korea, the Sangreho Space Sweepers 2021, that is the first instance of a transgender robot in film, where it is a male-voiced military robot, so like all metal, who wants to be a fully fleshed and human-passing woman, which you subtly get, and by the end of the film has got the skin graft and everything, but is kind of the first instance of that. So film's quite lagging when it comes to this kind of stuff.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Rachel?
Hi, thanks both of you. That was absolutely fascinating and really illuminating. I have a question for Rebecca. You've indexed female directors, which was really interesting to see. I was wondering if you'd done the same indexing for female writers, and if so, if you'd found any similar trends there.
Yeah, so what few female writers there were a part of a male and female team. So again, not really any instances of just ladies being in charge of any of those sort of steps. There were more writers than there were directors. I don't have those numbers on hand, but they do exist. But again, none of them just writing solo. They were always a part of a team of writers. I mean, not really surprising considering Hollywood being Hollywood. A bit more from Britain because usually they're a bit more ahead of America sometimes in these things, but not always.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. If I contacted you about those numbers that exist, would that be okay?
I can send you my film list if you like.
Oh,
I don't think I've I think I checked it once about how many were writers. The tricky part being that you can't always guess a gender by a name. Even some of the directors, I would literally look up photos and have to wiki them. And if they didn't have any information, I just had to guess, which is not 100% accurate because if their name is Robin, that can go either way, things like that. But yeah.
Sure, but absolutely, you say not necessarily writing solo, so it'd just be really interesting to see because I'm working in screenwriting and speculative fiction.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I have Malini up next.
Thank you to both speakers. So my question is for Rebecca. I was particularly intrigued by this film, Dr. Goldfoot and what is it, The Bikini Machine, and it's ludicrous. And I mean, I can't but help see a parody of the Bond movies in there. And I was wondering if it helps to sort of make more connections between how, like kind of how movies which don't actually show robots are sort of perhaps being critically reflected upon in, science fiction movies. I don't know if you have any thoughts of that.
I think Rebecca might have frozen.
Oh, is Rebecca frozen?
Do I need to repeat the question?
No, I think Rebecca is frozen at the moment, unfortunately.
Oh. Okay. John, might your question be for Dylan, and then we could come back to Malini and Rebecca?
Yeah, sure. That's a good idea. My question was actually for both of them, but maybe I'll try to make it. Yeah. In any case, thank you both for these wonderful presentations. I really enjoyed them. And yeah, well, so Dylan, but this is thinking about both of your presentations. I really, going to your reading of Metropolis and the sort of, sort of female agency rooted through objectification, so sort of personhood by way of being the object of the desiring gaze of whatever controlling humans there are. I was wondering, if you and really had both of you had thought about the kind of older reading of film itself as thriving on scopophilia, like the notion that film's conception of itself is that it only exists to the extent that it's seen. So there's a version of that, which I guess in science fiction would be kind of like the real toy idea that, things are brought to life by being gazed at and by being made part of the psychic life of the viewers. And that seemed very relevant. When I watch Metropolis, it also sort of reminds me of that Ruben Mamoulian movie, Applause, which is from the same time, in which the kind of lascivious gaze of the audience is like a crucial plot element, like that the people looking and salivating and wanting this, object to be desired is the way that someone gains subjectivity, like they're seen, and then by being seen, they become a person. And so, so Dylan, I just wondered if that is, sort of part of your thinking about how Metropolis plays around with the way in which the kind of fake Maria, gets to be real, kind of like the Velveteen Rabbit or something, like gets to be real by way of the desire of others.
Yeah, no, it is. And that's part of my kind of theoretical framework of my PhD thesis as well. I look at Adorno and Horkheimer and Guy Debord as well, specifically. who discuss how film is a specular process inherently, and how subjects who exist on film exist to be looked at and exist in this kind of image-based medium, where, you know, if we look at literature, as in text, you know, as in novels or even theater or poetry or something like that, it's much more of an engaging process, which engages much more with kind of, we'll say, all the senses. Whereas film, if we take a very cynical approach, you know, from the likes of Adorno, Horkheimer, all the kind of the like the Frankfurt School, we'll say, the film becomes a means to placate, a means to objectify, to imagify, to dilute any kind of subversiveness, because it is based on this kind of specular process. I think that's clear in Metropolis. I think the way agency and sexuality is portrayed for Maria is something which is corruptive of her like original kind of virginal, almost mother-like status. You know, as she becomes this embodiment of corruptive sexuality and kind of corruptive mechanization that's carried throughout SF. Where these two categories are combined, whereas agency and mechanization that combine to threaten and destabilize, which again is also objectified in an attempt to kind of to quell that threat, if that makes sense.
I'm wondering if Rebecca's here and might be able to join in, if Rebecca's able to come back in.
Yep, sorry about that. My internet has decided to occasionally blink on us, which it was doing so well. So I know Milani I got most of the question before my internet died. And yeah, I do mention connections to other things. And yeah, it's meant to be sort of a tongue-in-cheek satire with Dr. Goldfoot. So it is making a lot of reference to the sort of pop culture iconography of the time. And I make connections to things like action films. So seeing how women within there are presenting more active characters and the kind of transgressiveness of that. But then also, especially within my seductress type, that fine line between the sort of dominatrix figure as a fetish versus something that could be considered empowering. And a lot of that being the kind of way that they are depicted in that sense, because a lot of those characters have a lot of those kind of iconography around them, such as like in the third Terminator film, the first female Terminator we get is dubbed the Terminatrix, and when she arrives on Earth naked, like all the guys have done, she has a woman drive up in her car and just be like, "Oh my gosh, do you need help?" Every time Schwarzenegger showed up naked, the guys are like, "Hey, what happened?" Or like challenge him to a fight or whatever. And she just looks at this woman who's just offered her help and then kills her, takes her clothes, and wears them in a more seductive and sort of like exhibitive manner, sees a billboard, learns to inflate her breasts to get out of a parking ticket. Like all of these kind of things show how, I mean, and how every bit of discourse about her character was focused on her presentation of being female, not how lethal she was, how dangerous she was. Even though in the film, they're like, she's the most dangerous Terminator that's ever been. Even I can't beat her, kind of thing. But no, all that anybody cares about is that she's sexy, essentially. So that happens a lot.
Did you want to pick up from that on to John's question about the visual medium of film?
I didn't hear John's question. What was it entirely?
Okay. Mm-hmm. Maybe John can just encapsulate the question.
Oh, sure. So thanks, Rebecca, for your wonderful paper. I mean, it was kind of a question about sort of the self-consciousness of film itself and scopophilia as like definitive both of kind of, of the regard of any kind of film that only thrives by being seen. So the definition of selfhood or empowerment coming by way of, being an object of others' desires.
Yeah, so that actually weirdly comes into play in multiple ways in a lot of the films that I saw. So in Steel and Lace, the scopophilia is quite literal in that her creator models the gynoid on his sister who committed suicide after being gang raped, and her rapists were all let off. She kills herself. He makes a gynoid and designs her to cater to each of these men's particular desires. She then seduces them, and just at the point where they think they're like gonna get off, she kills them and records all of it for him to watch. So that scopophilic desire is a big one. And the camera often like looks to her in the moment where she's revealing her breasts or whatever, and then out comes a saw to blade through them. But there's other instances where, yeah, their appearance is a big part of it. The fact that they are able to pass as human becomes a huge, like an ex machina, it's a huge part where she plays on putting on enough clothes to cover her metal parts. And the director deliberately wanted her to appear, have that exposed metal casing. And it's built into the film where it's just like, I could have made her so she passed as human, but then there'd be no test. She would pass. You would never question that she's a robot. What I wanted to see is if you'd still think she's sentient if you're constantly reminded of the fact that she is in fact a robot. So within film, the visual aspect is a huge part in a lot of these characters' depictions. Sometimes within that objectifying lens, where it's like they pass because they're attractive, they pass because, you know, they're capable of love or whatever. But some of that sentience, especially for the instances who kind of reclaim their embodiment, where there will be a scene where we get to see them having changed their appearance on their own, at like completely by their own choice, versus wearing what was put on them by other people. And I think visually those are really important moments that can be easily kind of overlooked because it is a sign of their agency and autonomy in just that small subtle way.
Do we have anyone else who'd like to put up their hand? Question? No.
Looks like there's a Hopkin comment.
I think that might be a legacy hand.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. Unless Rachel or Malini or Paul. Yeah.
All right, it's a legacy hand. I'll bring it down.
Yeah.
It's thanks for the two fascinating papers. They're really, really awesome and really thought-provoking. I'm just wondering, just picking up a point there, Rebecca, where you were describing these women who are these robot women who are the gynoids who are killers, and picking up a point with Dylan about the kind of multiple resonances that are overlaid onto Maria, that she is a witch, that she is the whore of Babylon, that there's something there going on in Metropolis with a link with German fairy tales where the threat is often feminized, even though it's Rotwang who lives in the castle in the heart of this thing. How far that up until a certain point, and I think Rebecca, by the time that your work is picking up this turning point, that hyper-modernity around the figure of the android and the gynoid and cinema itself is still locked into these deeply misogynistic and fearful views of women, that women are these terrible creatures that you suppress because they can beat you, even though, you know, you're being told that they can't do that to you, and that film is now presenting a different way of approaching it. I did some of the group chat around female voices in things like tom-toms and sat-navs, how far it's still locked into that kind of almost a hectoring or a nanny or your mother telling you things that you don't hear these male voices, and that although film has overtaken that view, the actual technology in the real world is still kind of locked into that notion of the female.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like as you're saying with that sort of conflict of the violence of women, something interesting, especially within the seductress type, is that while it is women being lethal, it's women being weaponized by men to be lethal. So for the majority of those instances, even within the lethality type itself, for the better part of the 20th century, it is a weaponized femininity controlled by cisgender men against other men. And as you were saying about the AI, I did quite a bit of digging into all of that. And for a good while there didn't actually have really decent responses for when people would ask inappropriate questions of the AI. And the level of sexual harassment that pretty much any female presenting artificial creation gets in proportion to what male presenting artificial creations within the real world probably surprises no one. The male ones don't really get asked, oh, how big's your penis? Or how's it going, in some sort of sexual reference. Whereas the ladies get questions like that all the time. And it like at first I think Siri's response to some of them was actually like a weird cheeky coy thing that nobody was happy about, in the sense that it's just like, oh great, so even our AI have to do the like yeah, please go away response that women in the real world often have to when they have unwanted advances. And it's only more recently that things like Cortana and Siri and Alexa actually have wrote responses that are kind of more saying no, but are still doing it in this very like no way, rather than being like that's disrespectful or calling out the person for using that kind of language or asking that kind of content to them. So that I think speaks very, very greatly about the social, again, that sort of fabular idea around women and femininity that exists, in that if it's presents as female, it will be sexualized and very likely to a certain extent be harassed. Like Tay AI, which was a Microsoft AI that was designed to learn based on its interactions with other people. And I think it famously took like 24 hours for her to start sexualizing and deprecating and being racist, which is not a great sign. But some of it is like people deliberately messing with these things, but still greatly speaks to the tone and content that people use when interacting with something that presents as female versus something that presents as male or neuter.
Shall we give the last word to Dylan? I think that question was also addressed to Dylan.
Yeah, sure. I suppose the thing I'd pick up on there is again, just bring back to Metropolis, which is my favorite. It's quite interesting the way when we talk about the female android and how it's treated differently to, we'll say, a male robot or that kind of thing. It's what interests me a lot is how Maria, well, both Marias. There's the original real human Virgin Maria. There's the demonic machine Maria. While both are clearly kind of the images cast upon the woman, one is very much allowed to exist. It's the mother, it's the virgin, it's the image of femininity or female agency that nurtures a kind of patriarchal sense of order and control, but whereas the one which threatens it, it's the sexualized one. It's after she does the erotic kind of provocative dance. That's the turning point. That's where the female robot or android becomes, oh, now she needs to be burned at the stake, because this is an agency of her own. It's not an agency that we've cast upon her. Similarly, the speeches that she gives to the workers, all this, it's just to placate as well. Really, it isn't until the workers are presented with like a real sense of actual autonomy that they actually do something about it. Again, that's portrayed as this kind of chaotic, destructive rebellion which doesn't go anywhere. But that's just another means to kind of to say, oh, this version of agency is bad, as opposed to the one which we want her to portray. So.
Well, I wish there was time for a question about optimism here, and that's interesting because we started with this idea of the liminality of the post-human, perhaps offering a more egalitarian space, but it feels like all our questions have kind of returned to, unfortunately, the status quo that's still playing out in our cultural imaginary. But we think we've asked a lot of questions of it. So thank you very much. I'm conscious of the time, and Heather keeping her eye on the time. So I'm going to wrap up now with thanks again to Rebecca and Dylan and everyone for your questions.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think we're back at 1:30, right?
That's right, yeah.
All right, thanks everyone. Enjoy your lunch break.
See you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Well, you're a smelly little man.